Hey YouTube, Caroline Guntur here from searchingscandinavia.com, and in this video I'm going to give you the top 15 ways in which you can find the home parish for your immigrant ancestor. This is one of the biggest hurdles that researchers come across, and of course it's the key, it's the details that unlock the records in the homeland. So this is something that you want to focus a lot of your attention on, and it can be quite tricky sometimes, but I'm going to give you my top 15 ways that I have seen that are successful. And this is a sneak peek of a video that you can find inside my course and coaching program, Searching Sweden, which is all about how you find your Swedish ancestors in online archives. You can check that out at searchingsweden.com if you are interested. And of course, as always, don't forget to ring the bell and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. All right, so before we get started, let me just say that this video does focus a lot on the immigration from Sweden to the United States. That's simply because it was such an overwhelming amount of Swedish immigrants that came to the US. But if you have an ancestor that ended up someplace else like Australia or Africa, please don't let that deter you, because the same tips, tricks, and techniques can still be used to find the home parish for your ancestor. You may just have to look in a different repository, okay? So just know that. And without further ado, here are my top 15 tips. The first idea is to ask for first-hand knowledge, and that is something that I recommend to any beginner. The first part of any genealogy journey, regardless of what you're looking for, should always be to ask other family members or extended family members what they know, assuming that they're still around. You might be surprised by this technique as to how much you haven't heard before. So see if there's anybody who might have first-hand knowledge about where your person of interest came from. This could be your grandfather who's still alive, who might remember his grandfather telling a story, or perhaps it's a cousin who's done more genealogy work than you, who knows more, or perhaps there are just other family stories that have been passed down. Of course, we know that family stories are not always 100% accurate, but whatever they may be, they are still a starting point. So always check what the older generation or people in your extended family has to say, because you might find your answers very quickly that way. The second place where you might find a location is on the backs of old photos. Those of you who know me well know that photos are a big part of my business, because in addition to Searching Scandinavia, I also own organizingphotos.net. So I help people with their photos all day long. And I love photos because there are so many clues that you can take away from them. If you have old photos that have been passed down, make sure to look at the backs for any captions or information about the homeland. Professional photos often also have a photographer's insignia on it, and sometimes even the location of the studio. Smaller villages usually didn't have a photographer, but larger cities did. So if you find a portrait like that, you are likely looking at the closest major city to your ancestor's home. And if you can pin down that location, then that is an amazing clue as to what area of the country your ancestor came from. And sometimes that's enough. Of course, you can also look for clues in the photographs themselves. My colleague Lisa and I actually did a webinar series on this a couple of years ago, and I'll be sure to link to those recordings underneath this video. Idea number 3 is to look for letters and postcards, because just like photos, they have a ton of information in them. Letters is one of the most common things I deal with in the genealogy side of my business, and I'm very used to getting emails that say, hey Caroline, I found some old letters in my grandfather's collection. Can you please help me translate them? I didn't learn Swedish and I don't understand what's in them, but I know it's gold, so I'd love to know what it says. Please help me. So I deal with that a lot, and I often see that there is invaluable information inside of those letters and even on postcards. So you are looking at a potential treasure trove of information here. Yes, they can definitely be hard to decipher and translate, but it's usually worth the effort because they are handwritten accounts that give you firsthand information and context about the life of your ancestor. When a person emigrated, He or she often kept in touch with relatives and friends back home, as did I when I first came to the United States. And it was also common for one person to emigrate only to be followed by friends and other family members. They often also settled in the same places, so it's not uncommon to find a few people from the same village in Sweden living in close proximity to each other in their new homeland. So clues to look for in letters and postcards are stamps and notations about when and where they were posted. And most often Swedish letters will have the location and date that it was written in the top right-hand corner. You also want to look at the envelopes for clues as to where they were mailed from or if there were return addresses. If so, that could be a great clue, even if the person who sent it wasn't a relative. And if you have the ability to get the contents of letters translated, please do, because oftentimes you'll see names of farms, names of people, and other information that could be the missing links that you need. The one thing to keep in mind is that Europe uses a different format than the United States. So if you see 2/3, for example, that would mean March 2nd, not February 3rd. I can't tell you how many times I got that wrong when I first moved to the US, so be mindful of that. The next idea is to look for obituaries. So if you haven't already found an obituary with your ancestor's name on it, make sure you look in newspapers for that, because in many cases it will include a brief biography with a year of birth, a place of birth, and sometimes even a year of immigration. Sometimes we also see that it mentions surviving relatives, and if they are still living in Scandinavia, it might include a place. And then you might be able to trace those people to get to the home parish. And even if you don't find an obituary in the city where your ancestor lived, still look for obituaries in places where all the relatives lived, because it could be that they ran an obituary in their local newspaper instead. To get you started, Ancestry has great collections of obituaries. You can also check obituaries.com, newspapers.com, and of course your local libraries, among other places. Similar to obituaries, you also want to look for newspaper articles, whether they are announcements, ads, or local event reports, because sometimes you can get really lucky in finding a place of origin mentioned there. And even if you don't find that, you could still possibly get a lot of useful information out of articles, like names and addresses of relatives, for example, and that in turn can lead you closer to the information that you need. Newspapers.com is a great place to find articles online, but that's just one example. You want to research what newspapers are available in the area where your ancestor lived, and then find out where you can find old copies of those newspapers. Many local libraries will have great collections that you can browse, so be sure to check for that. The next idea is to look for naturalization records, because if your ancestor moved to a new country permanently, it's very likely that he or she also became a citizen of that country. I received American citizenship myself not too long ago, and though the process may have changed a bit since your ancestor applied, one thing remains the same: lots and lots of paperwork. And lots of paperwork translates to a lot of information. So you want to take it upon yourself to see if you can find a naturalization record for your ancestor. In the US, the application for naturalization includes a biography section where the applicant must fill in all personal details like place of birth and date of immigration. That can be a true goldmine of information. Big online sites like Ancestry.com have wide-ranging databases already online that you can search quite easily. And if you're lucky, you'll be able to find a declaration of intent or an application that includes the full name, the date and place of birth, the date of immigration, how long the person has been in the country, if there was a spouse or another dependent present at the time of the application, whether the person was married, and so on. Sometimes it also lists personal information for all the family members. I usually recommend trying to look for a naturalization record before ever moving to passenger records, because it's a lot easier to know that you have the right person that way. You've already learned about the patronymic system that's used in Scandinavia, so you now know that a lot of names look very similar. This is where a lot of people accidentally take a wrong turn and end up in somebody else's family tree. So if you have a date of immigration already down, and possibly even the name of the ship, it's going to be much, much easier to narrow down the right person. Obviously, we still have to verify the information, but you'll be dealing with a much shallower pool of suspects. Another idea is to also look for a passport application. Because if your ancestor ever applied for a passport in the new country, that application is potentially also a goldmine of information. Just like the applications for naturalization, they usually contain a date and place of birth for the applicant, even if he or she is still a naturalized citizen. Not only that, but because the forms were actually very similar, they have a lot of the same blanks to fill in, including details about immigration, a place of residence, lists of family members, occupations, physical descriptions, and so much more. Best of all, many passport applications also include a photo, so don't miss that opportunity to find that. Ancestry.com has some great databases for you to start with, so be sure to look there for your ancestor's name. Next up, death certificates and death indexes. In fact, death records in general is another really good source of information because it naturally mentions when the person was born, because the death certificate needs to compute the age at death. And if you're lucky, it will not only say when the person was born, but also where the person was born. And if you're really, really lucky, you'll get a more detailed location. I've seen that many times. In fact, I've also seen that information show up quite a bit in the general death indexes. For example, the Social Security Death Index here in the United States. And even the state death indexes are a good source of information for this. Obviously, you always want to pull the original death certificate, but I have seen many, many times that the death indexes will have that information. So be sure to look for a death certificate and death index database hits for your ancestor because they could reveal a lot of information. The next idea is to look for a draft registration card. And this is if you had an ancestor that served in a war. Sometimes those registration cards will say only Sweden for place of birth, but again, if you're lucky, there'll be a city there or even an address. A draft registration card will usually also have a next of kin that can be contacted if the soldier dies, so you may be able to find a relative there with a Swedish address. And even if there isn't a Swedish address, you'll still have the information for the next of kin, which can then possibly lead you back to Sweden. So don't overlook the draft registration cards and think about what war or conflict did my ancestor possibly serve in, and see if there is any documentation at all for that. Idea number 10 is Swedish American church books. These were church books from Lutheran churches in Swedish settlements abroad that kept track of people in a very similar way to how it was done in Sweden. In fact, the Swedes have always been pretty good at record keeping, and when they emigrated, they took those skills with them to their new parishes. So a lot of those books have now been preserved and digitized, and you can find many of them through sites like Ancestry or through Swedish American organizations and archives. Of course, not all Swedes joined a church in their new home, but it is worth checking for because if they were in fact members, those records will often include the full name of the person, where and when the person was born, when the person immigrated, and when the person joined the congregation. The next idea is to look for a will or for probate documents. So this is after your ancestor died. If your ancestor left behind any will, that could hold information about relatives. And probate documents sometimes have information about the place of birth, although it's a bit more rare than the other examples. Still, it's worth a look because even if it only says Sweden, it's another piece of evidence that can bring you closer to solving the case of the home parish. When you are looking for somebody's home parish, any clues about the early life is important. So a birth date, a date of immigration, or any other detail like that is something to note, and those details add up eventually. If you are trying to find a will or probate documents, Ancestry is a great place to start for this. But please don't stop looking if they don't have anything, because many of these types of documents have not been digitized. So it could be that a local archive has something for you that they can pull up. Research the area where your ancestor passed away to see where those types of documents would be held. When you have an idea of when and where your ancestor immigrated, you'll want to look for a passenger record. Passenger records can be a great help, and if you're lucky, you'll find an ancestor listed with a place of origin and a destination address. Sometimes it'll also list a next of kin and if the person is traveling to visit somebody. It might also say if the person is an immigrant or a citizen. Before you attempt to find your ancestor in any passenger lists, though, do a little research to narrow down a possible year of immigration. Commonly, you can find clues in census records or in naturalization papers, especially if your ancestor applied for citizenship in the United States. Having that little bit of information will help separate your ancestor from other passengers with similar names. If you don't know where your ancestor arrived, look in a variety of places. Don't limit your search to Ellis Island. There were many other ports and points of immigration besides New York, for example, Boston and Philadelphia, and it's very, very possible that your ancestor came through one of those ports. Another thing to consider is the community, both in the home country and in the new country. Emigrants often go towards what they know and seek out an environment and climate they are used to from back home. Because of this, we often see that Swedes who were from the south settled in the Midwest, especially in the farming communities there. Why? Because southern Sweden is known for farming. Skåne, especially, produces most of Sweden's food supply and almost all of its dairy products. So those from the south tended to settle in Wisconsin, Illinois, Idaho, Kansas, and Nebraska, states that are known for farming and food production. Those Swedes who worked in the lumber industries, which is a lot of Svealand and south of Norrland, they didn't go to the Midwest as much. They moved a lot towards the Pacific Northwest. Why? Well, we saw similar industries there, and they already knew that work. This, of course, doesn't always hold true. Some people wanted to change. But think about it. If you arrive in a new country, you tend to find work in areas where you're already very skilled. So look for the industry that the person worked in and research where in Sweden that would be common if it's a specialized trade. For example, mining, masonry, fishing, farming, and so on. Another thing that can be helpful here is to simply look on a map to see if you can spot any names that might give clues as to the people who live there. Because when immigrants settled new land, they often named cities and areas after places in the old country. That's why we have places with the word new in front of it. For example, New Orleans. Orléans is in France, and Louisiana used to belong to the French, right? Who named it after Orléans in their homeland, and it's now New Orleans. So this may sound obvious, but it's worth a look. Emigrants clustered together in cities too, which is why we have Greektown and Chinatown and the Ukrainian village here in Chicago. And that happened a lot in rural places as well. A great example of this is Malmö, Nebraska. As you may already know, Malmö is the largest city in southern Sweden, and a lot of people from the south settled in Nebraska. So that's why it's called that. This is, of course, again, not always accurate, but it is a possibility to be considered. So think about the community in a new light when you're researching your ancestor. Next up is friends and relatives. I use this technique quite a bit, and I can't recommend it enough. It's very common to not always be able to pin down the person you're researching right away, but by looking at the person's network, meaning their friends, their family members, their neighbors, their acquaintances, you can narrow this down and get on the right track really quickly. Immigrants often hung out with other immigrants and settled in the same areas. So if you're able to find out information about where they are from, it's possible that you can locate your ancestor via them. I have found countless hometowns based on tracing siblings and friends who also emigrated. So I know this technique works really well. If your ancestor knew them, you want to know them. Finally, rounding out the top 15 is the DNA testing. If you are brand new to family history and you're not sure where in Sweden or even in Scandinavia that your ancestor came from, a DNA test can go a long way towards confirming your roots. If you haven't already taken one, give this a try. These tests are so cheap to order nowadays that I would argue that it's a must. DNA doesn't lie, and even if you know where your family's from, this can confirm the paper trail that you find. When these tests first came on the market, they weren't nearly as detailed as they are today. Nowadays, you can find out exactly what area in Sweden your DNA points to, and that can be an amazing head start if you're having trouble with the regular records. Some great places to take DNA tests are Ancestry.com and 23andMe for the US, Ancestry again for the Australians, and FamilyTree DNA for the Europeans. All right, that was my top 15. I hope that was helpful in giving you some ideas of how to find your ancestors' home parish. If you still don't have anything after all of these ways, don't give up. There still may be records just on the other side of the pond. In most cases, we'll be able to find something, so just stick with it and we'll crack the case at some point. I'll see you in the next video.